I'm back again. I think this is the third for today. Very good. We're moving along. In the early 20th century, after years upon years of American intervention in Mexico, including the exaltation, as I've explained, and the assassination of Emperor Maximilian, who was a liberal and a Mason, I believe, in his own right, and the administration of President Woodrow Wilson decided to use Mexico as a grand laboratory to engineer regime change in which Wilson's principles of liberalism, which came from the French Revolution, were to be implemented for the education of the Mexican people. Freedom, obviously, though, is but a slogan here in the United States of America. It has always been a slogan, despite the delusional nationalism that passes for authentic patriotism that each of us was immersed in from the time of our birth. Woodrow Wilson would use slogans to suppress dissent during American involvement in what we now call World War I. Although at the same time it was called the Great War or the World War. For all of Wilson's sloganeering to justify American involvement in this needless war of nationalism fought by the formerly Catholic countries of Europe, and his desire to make the world safe for democracy, which is not why young men all from all over Europe were dying on the battlefields, principally of Belgium and France in trench warfare. They died there because their governments had conscripted them and told them they had to go and fight and die there. Wilson had the iron will and the heart of a tyrant, of an autocratic, would-be aristocratic tyrant. This is why he fully supported, in 1917 and 1918, sometimes my tongue gets tied. Venustiano Carranza's crackdown on the Catholic Church and insisted that he be removed once he recognized in 1918 that the anti-clerical provisions of the 1917 Constitution be relaxed. So Wilson supported Carranza, one Mexican dictator, who, because he cracked down on the Catholic Church, and once Carranza was convinced not to enforce the provisions of the hideous Masonic, really Bolshevik Constitution of 1917 as stringently as he had enforced it, then he was no use. Dr. Michael Kenny described that Wilson ignored all evidence of the crimes being committed by the Carranza regime in 1915. This is from Dr. Michael Kenny's book, No God Next Door. It was said that libertarian slogans appealed to him. They were the Constitutional Party. For like their Calles continuators, they were fluent in fine labels, as were all, and have been all revolutionaries, as is Obama. Income equality, fairness, carry your fair share. It's all a means to confiscate income, to make us more and more slaves to the state. So we have to respond to regulations on the use of our private property, to attack natural law rights, to kill the innocent preborn, to promote evil, perversity, to brainwash students in these so-called public schools, to promote indecency and modesty, all manner of vice, under cover of law, in the name of freedom, virtue, tolerance, charity. Once again, Dr. Kenny, it was said that their libertarian slogans, that is, that of the Carranza's Constitutionalist Party, appealed to him. They were the Constitutional Party. For like their Calles continuators, they were fluent in fine labels that belie the contents. Their gangsterism is labeled liberalism, so is Obama's. So is the Republican parties. Their agrarian brigandage is peon emancipation. Their state swindling is national finance. Their communism is concentrated capitalism. Their free education is compulsory de-Christianization. You see? Don't ever send your child to a public school, ever. It's compulsory de-Christianization. Homeschool is the only answer, nothing else. And their freedom of thought is atheism gone totalitarian. Carranza's constitutional label was accepted by Mr. Wilson as genuine despite his reply to James Cardinal Gibbons admitting the extent and enormity of that party's crimes against life, liberty, and religion. These were but regrettable incidents in the great cause of constitutionalizing Mexico by putting the constitutional president out and forcing the most unconstitutional in. So we got rid of one bad fella. We put in another one. So a few Catholics died. This is 1914, 1915. Father Francis Clement Kelly, then later Bishop Francis Clement Kelly, was told the following to his face when he, representing the American bishops in the Extension Society, of which he was the first head, met with Wilson at the White House, and as the anti-clerical sieges of Carranza, as early as 1915, about the anti-clerical sieges of Carranza, as early as 1915, after Carranza took his stolen office. Wilson replied, after Father Kelly in 1915 outlined and documented the crimes in 1915, 11 years before the beginning of the Cristeros War. Wilson replied, I have no doubt but that the terrible things you mention have happened during the Mexican Revolution. But terrible things happened also during the French Revolution, perhaps more terrible things than have happened in Mexico. Nevertheless, out of that French Revolution came the liberal ideas that have dominated in so many countries, including our own. I hope that out of the bloodletting in Mexico, some such good yet may come. In other words, too bad. So the Catholics were guillotined in France. Out of that came the liberal ideas that have dominated in so many countries, including our own. Liberalism was salvific for Wilson, not Catholicism. It was liberalism that was salvific. I hope that out of the bloodletting in Mexico, some such good may yet come. And Robert Leckie of the book, who wrote the book American Catholic, I think he died in 2000 was it? 2001? Noted as follows in 1970. Having thus instructed his visitor as to the benefits which must perforce accrue to mankind out of the systematic robbery, murder, torture, and rape of people holding a proscribed, that is, a forbidden religious conviction, the professor of politics, Wilson, that is, suggested that Father Kelly visit Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who expressed his deepest sympathy. Obviously, the Wilson administration was committed to supporting the revolutionaries. All efforts of Catholics to succor their co-religionists across the border were to prove fruitless, as they were to prove once again in 1924, when the fiercest of all was begun by President Plutarco Calles. Bishop Kelly described this in his own book, Blood-Drenched Altars, described that same meeting with Wilson. Carranza was chosen by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, to be the President of Mexico. When the Turks massacred the Armenians, the Christian world shouted its protest. This is Bishop Kelly, Bishop Francis Clement Kelly. When he met with Wilson in 1915, he was Father Kelly. When the Russians murdered the Jews, the shout was repeated. No people shouted louder against the massacres than the Americans and the English. About the horrors perpetrated against the Catholics of Mexico, few voices were raised, including Catholics, the voice of Catholics. President Wilson told an Indianapolis audience that he would allow the Mexicans to shed all the blood they wanted. Now, I've been trying to find that speech online. I'm going to take Bishop Francis Clement Kelly's word on that, because it's Wilson, to a tape. And this is his own account of how the meeting was described by, his meeting with Wilson was described by Robert Leckie. He told me in his office in the White House that as the inspiration of democracy had come out of the French Revolution, which had shed as much blood as Carranza and his men, perhaps something good would come out of the Mexican debacle. His words were offered in consolation. I thanked him and withdrew. And Dr. Kenny summarized all of this in his own book, No God Next Door. Summarized the roots of what led up to Wilson and Wilson's complicity. Said it has been shown by documented proof that our first United States envoy organized a Masonic political machine for the dominance of Mexico by the ousting of the Catholic Church and its culture from school and temple in the hearts of its people, and by the securing, therefore, the armed forces of the United States at the price of half its territory and a preponderance over all. We have also seen how the price was paid and how the President James Buchanan, who was president from March 4th, 1857 to March 4th, 1861, to Wilson. That means James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft Wilson. And how from Buchanan to Wilson we furnished arms and armies and whatever other aid was requisite to empower bandit factions to eradicate religion and culture and civil liberties. Whether it was under Juarez, no matter who was leading, Catholics suffered. Catholics suffered in Mexico in the 19th century. Juarez more or less had a implicit understanding that he would not persecute overtly. All of that changed after him and resulted in the killing of the Cristeros Wars. And it was during the Cristeros Wars that American Masonry came to the defense of Calles. And in Washington, D.C., the Supreme 33rd Degree Council, which had 3 million American Masons, issued a statement supporting Calles' war against the Catholics. 3 million, it represented 3 million Masons in this country. In the name of the Supreme Council, of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite of this nation and of Mexican Masonry in general, we present our sincere recognition to Calles. This was a note to Calles, a cable to President Coolidge the Grand Commander of Mexico, Rojas, in conjunction with the Washington Council. In the name of the Supreme Council of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite of this nation and of Mexican Masonry in general, we present our sincere recognition. This was a note to a cable to President Coolidge, for your firm stand in refusing to participate in any manner in the so-called Mexican religious conflict. As President of that great republic, regardless of the pressure brought to bear upon your government for that purpose, the only way to maintain the Roman Catholic clergy to submit unconditionally to the will of the people as expressed in the Constitution, the will of the people. And as we know, during the 3 years of the Cristeros War, the United States eventually would fund, because of the presence of oil, the oil and banking interests, and American sympathy with Mexican Masonry and the Mexican revolutionary cause in favor of liberty, arm the Calles regime against the Catholics. Not even the murder of Father Miguel Augustine Pro would matter. It wouldn't matter to Catholics. It didn't matter to Will Rogers, as I've quoted, who was there at the very time that Father Pro was murdered, who joked with Calles, and the car taking, the limousine taking Will Rogers, American Ambassador Dwight Morrow, and Calles to a luncheon meeting was delayed because of the funeral throng, because of the throng of the people seeking to bury, because there was no funeral, was proscribed, to bury the body of Father Miguel Augustine Pro. Were American Catholics outraged by the execution of Father Pro, or by the support given him by his murderer Calles, support given his murderer Calles by Dwight Morrow and Will Rogers? Some were. Most were not. And it was reported, including most of the American bishops, men who had rallied around the colors during the Spanish-American War and World War I and wanted no part of active criticism of the government of the United States of America, because they believed that if they were overtly critical of the American government, they would be called unpatriotic, and therefore anti-Catholicism would be raised anew. Fearful of human respect, hardly apostolic courage. Only the Knights of Columbus, which today permits, as you know, pro-abortion, pro-perversity Catholics to remain in its ranks, as they are, of course, in good standing in the counterfeit Church of Conciliarism. How can the Knights kick out people who are in good standing in what is thought to be the Catholic Church? So the Knights keep them in. They're not going to be more Catholic than their quote-unquote pope, a false pope. But only the Knights of Columbus in the 1920s raised its voice in behalf of the Mexican martyrs. Typical of the indifferent attitude of the American bishops was that encountered by Mexican student leader Rene Capistran Garza, associated with the League for the Defense of Religious Liberty in Mexico, and the Cristeros were dying for Christ the King, not for religious liberty, although some did believe, some of the intellectual leaders did believe in religious liberty, for the toleration of the church in Mexico, who attempted to garner support from the American bishops for their cause of the suffering Catholics to the south. And I'm going to quote rather extensively from Mary Ball Martinez's book on that describes the undermining of the Catholic Church. It's entitled The Undermining of the Catholic Church. It's an out-of-print book. I happen to have a copy. And Mrs. Martinez, who was a journalist, and one of the criticisms of her book is that it's not footnoted. Journalists sometimes don't footnote. I provide parenthetical references in my scholarly work. There are different ways of citation. My citations are parenthetical, for those of you who know my writing, and all of my typographical errors, which, if I saved my soul, if I managed to die in a state of grace, God permits me the grace to go to purgatory, sinner that I am. I think I'll spend my purgatory, in addition to suffering the time of purification by fire, which is not a fun thing, but you're assured of your salvation, but there is suffering, real suffering, painful suffering, to be purged of self, purified of self. Nothing impure can enter heaven. I probably will have to be correcting each one of my typographical errors, which means I'm going to be there for a time. And I don't say that jokingly. But in any event, I try to cite. But one of the criticisms of Mrs. Mary Ball Martinez's work was that there's no citation. I think it's pretty accurate. I'm going to rely upon it, and I have. This is her account of student leader Rene Capistran Garza in his effort to seek the support of the American clergy, of the American bishops. In an open second-hand Studebaker, meaning a convertible. In the dead of winter, he and a bilingual companion made their way to Texas armed with letters of recommendation to bishops and regional commanders of the Knights of Columbus. Stopping first in Corpus Christi, which is where my parents' mortal remains are buried, they stood waiting for the bishop to read their credentials. When they told their story, concluding, they heard words they could not scarcely believe. Nothing doing, sorry. That was the Bishop of Corpus Christi. In Galveston, the bishop took out a $10 bill out of his pocket and handed it to them. Houston, Dallas, Little Rock bought hardly enough to pay for their gasoline at 1926 prices. Then in the prosperous German diocese of St. Louis, the bishop gave them $100 of his own. But at that point, the Studebaker broke down, and in order to repair it, the youths had to pawn an heirloom gold watch and a new pistol. Meeting constant rejection, they drove through sleet and snow to Indianapolis, Dayton, Pittsburgh, and finally to the great Archdiocese of Boston, already famed for its covey of Irish Catholic millionaires. Cardinal William O'Connell, then the Archbishop of Boston, 1927, received their letters and listened to their tale. Then he made his contribution. It took the form of advice. I exhort you and your people to suffer in patience the trials that God has sent you. He added that if either of them felt like abandoning their project in order to look for jobs in Boston, he would be happy to give them the letters of recommendation. These were the American bishops. No controversy with the government. The same today. You mark my words. The American bishops, so-called, the conciliar non-bishops, the Eastern Rite bishops here in this country are bishops if they've been ordained, consecrated rather by, first of all, ordained in the Eastern Rite by a true Eastern Rite bishop and consecrated by a true Eastern Rite bishop in the Eastern Rite. So some of the American bishops, a few, handful are Eastern Rite, would be true bishops. Most are not. This is how they were treated. They didn't want criticism of the government. You mark my words, these non-bishops today, they will find some way to make their accommodation with Obama on the so-called contraception health insurance mandate. Mrs. Martinez went on, when 2 months later, Rene and his friend Jose were home in Mexico, their hope was to soar for a last time. the Texas oilman William F. Buckley, yes, the father of William F. Buckley Jr., William F. Buckley Jr., who had spent much time in Mexico, notified them that he had persuaded his good friend Nicholas Brady, the Knight of St. Gregory and Duke of the Papal Court, in whose mansion is housed today the Jesuit Retreat House in Syrington, New York, on Syrington Road, just a little bit north of the Long Island Expressway, south of 25A, Northern Boulevard. That's my home bailiwick. They have a Zen meditation room in Innisfada, which is Gaelic for Long Island. They have a, which was the name of the mansion, Innisfada, and they have a Zen meditation room. A friend of mine, I'm a former benefactor. Just to support my work now, we pray for him every day. A very, very fine man. Back in 2000, he and his wife and a very true priest were visiting me on Long Island. We had a nice time at the Millerage Inn. We went to see Innisfada, show them around. I showed these good people the Zen meditation room, and the gentleman, a very fine Catholic gentleman, he doesn't see the truth. He won't see the truth. He's a businessman. He doesn't want to see it. Catholic Church can't give us error. She is spotless, virginal, immaculate. Took me long enough to see it. I condemn nobody. But this good man with such a wonderful Catholic heart planted miraculous medals in that Zen meditation room. Anyhow, but Nicholas Brady, Buckley Sr., and William F. Buckley Sr., had convinced Nicholas Brady to donate $1 million to the cause. Arriving in New York after the long train journey, Rene Garza Capistran found that the Vatican's no placet had got to Brady, that is, not pleased, ahead of him. One can only conclude that to have turned men like Brady and O'Connell, who was an anti-Americanist, it should be noted, away from helping so Catholic a cause as that of the Cristeros, the Vatican message must have been not only peremptory, but noxious. And that was Cardinal Gasperi, who we're going to be talking about in the next presentation momentarily. And as I've indicated, there was no press coverage in the United States of America of the horrible crimes that Calles and his puppets committed against the Catholic Church and believing Catholics in the 1920s and 1930s. Although there had been persecution in the immediate aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, it was in the third and fourth decades of the 20th century the persecution was at its height. There was no television, no less on-the-spot satellite newscasts and or photographs or videos of the conflict. Most of the people in the world had no idea how much Catholics were suffering, and they had no idea of the incredible conspiracy that led Masons of the United States of America to make sure that the government of this country gave its full support to their fellow Freemason, Plutarco Elias Calles. With a virtual blackout of press coverage of the United States of America and the world, officials in the Vatican had to rely upon the information provided them by means of letters and the personal eyewitness testimony of those who, including bishops and priests, had left Mexico and made their way to Rome. The Ethereal Cardinal Gasperi, who was busy with negotiations that led to concordats with various European countries, and he was the Secretary of State under Pope Pius XI, including Poland, and most particularly the Kingdom of Italy, was not interested in the suffering of Mexican Catholics or supportive of any rebellion against Calles. He was a diplomat, and he wanted to be on friendly terms with the leaders of regimes to provide legal frameworks for the life of the Church in various countries. Diplomats want diplomatic solutions. There are times, as a last resort, when armed conflict is necessary, as it was in Mexico. I outlined all of that in my series. I've discussed the principles of the just war in an earlier part of this lecture program. Each of those were met in Mexico. Each of those were met. The next presentation, I'm going to be discussing Cardinal Gasperi's betrayal of the Mexicans and how, when Pope Pius XI realized he had been betrayed by Calles, and in turn had betrayed the cause of the Cristeros and the cause of the Church, which he thought he was aiding, he wept. But this is very important because Gasperi formed the mind Pope Pius XII, into the ways of accepting Americanism as the antidote to communism.